Thank you. Please be seated. Good afternoon. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has gathered today in this en banc session to remember and to honor Judge Tom Reavley. Among us is Judge Carolyn Deneen King, Judge Reavley's widow. We welcome other members of Judge Reavley's family as well as friends, former law clerks, and our court staff. Judge Reavley joined our court in July of 1979 following his nomination by President Jimmy Carter and a swift Senate confirmation. He served as a judge on this court for more than 40 years. Judge Reavley was a towering figure, both literally and figuratively. He was beloved by his colleagues and all who knew him, and countless numbers of people were blessed to know Judge Reavley. His life was full. It was rich. He was devoted to public service. He was a person of faith. And he was a defender of those who were not as fortunate as he and who suffered oppression and indignities. This afternoon, we're going to hear from two people who were very close to Judge Reavley, Brian Garner and Judge Reavley's son, Thomas Wilson Reavley. Brian Garner will be going first. He has a long, impressive resume, but I'm not going to go through all of his accomplishments this afternoon. I'm just going to give you some of the highlights. First and foremost, Brian clerked for Judge Reavley from 1984 to 1985, after he graduated from the University of Texas Law School. Brian has written more than 25 books, including one with a foreword by Judge Reavley that Brian co-authored with Judge Reavley. Brian continues to practice law in the appellate area, and he teaches lawyers and judges all across the English-speaking world. I don't think that's an exaggeration. He writes 2 monthly columns, one for the ABA Journal and one for the National Review. Brian wrote 2 books with Justice Antonin Scalia. Brian has often been heard to say that his year with Judge Reavley was the most rewarding of his professional life. I've heard him say that many times. Brian, we look forward to your sharing with us some of your thoughts and memories of Judge Reavley.
May it please the court. I appear before the court today to salute the life and service of Judge Thomas M. Reavley. He was a universally respected and beloved member of this court, as you've heard, from 1979 to 2020. When Judge Reavley was asked to give a memorial talk for a late colleague in 1998, he said, "I will avoid comparing him to others because he would never have done so and would not approve of my speaking in those terms. It is usually meaningless to describe one human being or judge as the greatest or the best. But if we had to draw comparisons between him and others, we would be forced to look up, not down or horizontally." What do you remember? Do you remember his booming voice, his commanding presence, his personal magnetism, his clear-sightedness, his devotion to friendships, the way he'd answered his phone, "Reavley," his handsome jackets and ties, his Arnold Palmers, the way he stabbed his lettuce when eating a salad, That was perhaps the closest thing I ever saw to his perpetrating violence. Do you remember, how's my favorite judge? When I first heard him say that, I lingered to ask just who it was he'd been talking to. I wanted to know the identity of his favorite judge. It was Judge Carolyn Randall. So, Judge Randall is your favorite judge, I asked? Well, she certainly was when I was talking with her just now. I have lots of favorite judges. In the next instant, Judge Reavley's assistant announced that Judge Jolly was on the phone. He answered, how's my favorite judge? And so it was for many years. In the end, though, I think we all know who his favorite judge really was. In the fullness of time, we came to realize that it was Judge Carolyn Deneen King. I'm sorry to announce that so starkly and publicly, Judge Jolly. But I think you know it in your heart of hearts. Knocking was a big part of my clerkship. On the first day, he told me to knock once on his door and then enter without awaiting a response. I'll never be doing anything you can't know about, he said. If it's truly a private conversation that I don't want you to hear, I'll wave you off. But that never happened. And then there was the time here in this great courthouse that I knocked the judges in. The panel consisted of Judges Goldberg, Rubin, and Reavley. Fifth Circuit staffers had always been responsible for being bailiffs in those days and knocking in the judges. But Gilbert Ganishow, the clerk of court, had decided to shift that responsibility to law clerks. As I recall it, I was among the first clerks, and perhaps the very first, to serve in this role as bailiff. I was given a sheet enumerating my responsibilities. Number one said simply, knock in the judges. That's all. So I asked Judge Reavley precisely how best to do it. 3 strong raps at the door. I noticed there was one just now. 3 strong raps at the door using your entire forearm if possible. Make it well audible. You understand that those were, there were no brass knockers in those days. It was to be my first time to see a Fifth Circuit argument up close. As the time approached, I was in the West robing room with the judges. Judge Reavley helped Judge Goldberg don his robe. Then he said, knock us in, Mr. Garner. I went through the door into the courtroom and knocked as hard as I could 3 times. I went through the door into the courtroom and knocked 3 times. There was a muffled bellow inside. As I opened the door, it was Judge Reavley shouting, come in! All of the judges came out laughing as they took the bench. I didn't know that I'd done anything wrong by knocking from inside the courtroom as opposed to the robing room side of the door. When they emerged laughing, I just thought they were an especially jovial bench. That afternoon, at least a dozen Fifth Circuit staffers came by to say, I heard you knocked in the judges today. Judge Reavley never let me forget that moment. You'll doubtless remember his ability to explain a case of some complexity, both the facts and the law. He would speak deliberately as if a stenographer might be taking down his words. His unhurried manner of speaking was slower in 1982 than it was 36 years later. Often there would be a 5-second gap of silence within a sentence as he searched for just the right word in explaining a case. I first witnessed this in our initial meeting in chambers when he asked me to be his law clerk. That came as quite a surprise. 2 weeks earlier, a retirement party had been held for Chief Justice Joe Greenhill at the brand new Texas Law Center. That night, in October 1982, my grandmother, the widow of Justice Meade F. Griffin, had introduced me to Judge Reavley. He had overlapped with my grandfather on the Texas Supreme Court for 2.5 months. Judge Griffin and Judge Reavley came to like each other, even though neither had ever voted for each other. When we were introduced, I told Judge Reavley that I'd just written a law note focusing on one of his decisions. He asked me to send it to him, and after I did, he arranged for me to meet him in chambers to discuss it. He said he was impressed by it, and he told me that he wanted me to be his law clerk. Shortly after I arrived on the job, in July 1984, Judge Reavley learned that I'd written a book while in law school, a dictionary of legal usage, and was hoping to get it published. At the beginning of my clerkship, I wrote 35 legal publishers to see, there used to be 35 of them, legal publishers to see whether I might get it into print. Over the next 9 months, Judge Reavley stayed informed about my progress or lack of it. I received 33 rejection letters, and whenever the subject of my book came up, Judge Reavley noticed a certain despair in my voice. But we were working so hard on opinions that the subject didn't often arise. Then one day, an editor from Little Brown called to say he wanted to fly down from Boston to meet with me. Judge Reavley said we should meet in chambers, and he wanted 20 minutes alone with the man before my meeting. I'll never know quite what was said in that meeting. You can imagine Judge Reavley's generosity as well as I can. Suddenly, after 8 months of repeated rejections, I had 2 offers to publish a dictionary of modern legal usage from Little Brown and from Oxford University Press. Judge Reavley wrote the foreword to that book, for which I'll always be grateful. 29 years later, we would become co-authors of a 900-page treatise on the law of judicial precedent, a project that involved 3 Supreme Court justices and 9 other appellate judges. Judge Reavley stayed interested in my books, all of them. He was as interested in me as any friend I've ever had. That's the way he was with people. I think he was the most thoughtful person I've ever known. Toward the end of my clerkship, we were sitting in his chambers right here in this courthouse. He called me into his office. Brian? I was always a one-syllable. Brian was one syllable. Brian? We've got a little problem. We're on a 5 o'clock flight tomorrow. That'll get us into Austin pretty late. But there's a 1:30 flight we might be able to make. I just can't figure out how. Our hearing ends at noon, and then the panel will need 10 or 15 minutes to divide up the cases. I don't see a problem, I said. If we leave at 12:20, we'll make the 1:30 flight. Those were the days, of course, before TSA and security checks. The problem, he said, is our bags. We have 2 heavy bags. If our cab circles back to the Royal Sonesta to pick up the bags, we'll never make the flight. Again, I don't see a problem, Judge. We'll bring the bags over to the courthouse with us and have them ready at 12:20. No problem. You mean use a cab before the sitting to take our bags from the Sonesta to the courthouse? Sure, I said, not expecting to be reproached. We can't do that, Brian. Those cab drivers start waiting in line at 4 a.m. They're depending on at least 2 airport runs a day to make a living wage. If we selfishly take a cab on a short run from the Sonesta over here, we'll be spoiling a cab driver's profits for the day. He will have been waiting 4 full hours in line to take us a quarter of a mile. Then he'll have to get back in line and wait 2 more hours before, and just hope to get an airport run. Seriously, we took 10 minutes sorting out how not to spoil an unknown cab driver's receipts the following day. In the end, we decided that I'd leave the hearing at 11:35, walk over to the Royal Sonesta, jog really, to retrieve our bags, get a cab, circle back around to the courthouse where Judge Reavley's unmistakable 6'5" frame would emerge, and that's what we did. I had never realized how much thought and time could go into considering the practicalities of some unknown person's daily life. Earlier on that same trip, as we walked down Bourbon Street, He gave a $5 bill to each panhandler that we encountered. He'd look him in the eye and say, "God bless you. Now you take care of yourself." "Judge," I said, "why do you do that? They'll probably just buy alcohol or drugs with it." "You don't know that, Brian. It's not for us to say. And if he does buy a little alcohol, maybe that's what he needs to ease the pain." I've never forgotten that. Seemingly everyone that I've related that story to has begun treating beggars rather more kindly. From 1985 until February 2020, I saw Judge Reavley 3 or 4 times a year, every year. We got together in Austin, Bellingham, Dallas, Fort Worth, New Orleans, and Houston. He gave advice whenever I asked, as long as he felt fully informed about the situation. And I asked with great frequency. He was like an oracle. He was the most serious student I've ever known about the subject of good judgment. He taught me that judgment is a skill to be cultivated and practiced. I don't think I'd ever known that before. This means, of course, that I can't make any serious decision without thinking of him. And what a fine thing that is. My grandmother, Dorothy Griffin, who introduced me to the judge, was a big believer in the Jungian idea of synchronicity, the phenomenon by which events coincide in time and appear meaningfully related but have no other discernible connection. What possessed me to write a law note about a Reavley case? I never expected to meet the man. Each of us in this room coincided in time and space with Thomas M. Reavley. Somehow, good fortune brought us into his orbit. Synchronicity. Most people gravitated toward him, and those of us who did will never be the same. I've often said that my Reavley clerkship was the best year of my professional life, and I've always meant it. The experience jump-started my career, but it also fastened into place some principles of conduct and of judging. Although I've never been a judge, I've taught judicial writing to state Supreme Courts in more than half the states and in several of the federal circuits. I consider myself a serious student of judging. Whenever I teach opinion writing, I focus on 4 key principles that I learned from Judge Reavley. Let's call them the Reavley principles. Here they are. Number 1, make sure that you're well informed not just about the contentions of the parties, but also about the record. The contentions must be understood in light of the record, and so either the judge or a trusted clerk must read the record from beginning to end, no exceptions. Number 2, make sure that everything you've said about the record is utterly honest. If there are inconvenient facts, don't brush them away with rhetorical flourishes. Deal with them candidly, even if that alters the result you're inclined to reach. Number 3, write your opinion with the losing litigant and the losing lawyer in mind. The winners will be happy enough with the result. You want the losers to know that you've understood their positions. As much as possible, you want them to know why they've lost. Ideally, you want the losers to be convinced that they've had their case heard by judges who are diligent, wise, and humane. That's how we build respect for the rule of law. Number 4, be succinct. Write absolutely no more than necessary, and write in a way that a smart high school student could understand. Doing this engenders respect for the law and for the courts. Never try to restate the law within a field. Never try to restate the law within a field. Let the law reviews do that. Even though you know the whole record, exclude almost all of it from the opinion. Include only the facts that illuminate the analysis. State the central problem clearly. Decide the case cleanly. Give your reasons briefly, and be done. I've tried to keep the Reavley principles in mind with everything I've written. Even though Judge Reavley wasn't much interested in grammar, he taught me more about legal writing than anybody else. It's an honor to speak to you today about a man I loved. Almost all of you had the experience of sitting on cases with Judge Reavley. When he was at his best, he was a paragon. I never saw him when he wasn't at his best. In 2006 and 2007, I filmed some interviews with Judge Reavley about his life. The last question I put to him in those interviews was this: what do you think are the cornerstones of what the Greeks called the good life? Here is his extemporaneous answer delivered after about 5 seconds of thought. Integrity, quote, integrity and attention to the mystery and miracles of life, and a regard for the sacredness of life. To be confined in our thinking to our immediate appetites and what we can understand and control is so limiting. Life is a miracle and it's sacred. We live amid wondrous mystery. This mystery is what inspires and leads to creativity in the artist and in the great leader. It leads to the capacity for love, of family, of spouses, of parents, of friends. It's the ground of growth. It leads to our commitment to the future and even to death. But it provides the joys and satisfactions of life. I do hope this pleases the court, and especially that it would please our judge for all seasons, Thomas M. Reavley. He had many ovations. Let us give him one last round of applause.
Brian, thank you. Most of us in this courtroom received a beautiful blue book that Brian was so gracious to compile for us. And in it was not so much Brian's recollections about Judge Reavley, but Judge Reavley's own words on so many different subjects. It's a beautiful, beautiful compilation. And Brian, thank you for that gift to each of us. We really appreciate it. Thank you. We are fortunate, as I mentioned earlier, to have Judge Reavley's son, Thomas Wilson Reavley, with us this afternoon. Like his father, Thomas Reavley became an attorney. He obtained his undergraduate degree from Stanford University and his law degree from Harvard University. He clerked for Justice Tom C. Clark at the Supreme Court of the United States from 1972 to 1973. Mr. Reavley was in private practice for many years, focusing primarily on commercial litigation, including oil and gas and energy issues. He served as the managing partner of the Austin law firm of Scott, Douglas, and McConaughey, known to many of us here on this bench. For the past 20 years or so, Mr. Reavley has been an arbitrator in commercial disputes, many of them involving very, very substantial claims. He has arbitrated or mediated more than 450 cases. His understanding of being a judge, I think it does not fall far from the tree. He currently divides his time between Austin, Texas, and Guanajuato, Mexico. Mr. Reavley, we look forward to hearing from you about your father.
May it please the court. I think I need to take a minute to orient myself and not sitting at Applee's table start contradicting or taking the other side of Brian's comments. But I do want to thank you, first of all, Judge Richmond, and all members of the court for honoring my father today, and particularly the perseverance of Judge Richmond dealing with the waves of the pandemic that seemed to coincide with the scheduling of this event. And I want to thank Brian especially for his comments, his stories about my father from the vantage point of somebody who clerked for him and worked for him. I was able to practice with my father for 2 years. I was a young lawyer in the Austin firm of Scott Douglas at the time. And, you know, this was between when he left the Texas Supreme Court and when he he began his service on this court. But really, I'm not really qualified, I think, to speak about my father as a judge and a lawyer. The other thing I want to say preliminarily, Judge King suggested I mention this. You know, as gracious as my father was, like many of us, he liked to have a certain amount of control of things. And most of my remarks, not all of them, most of them, I actually tried out on him. His portrait was hung in the Texas Supreme Court some years ago. He resisted that for many years. He didn't like a lot of fuss, as he would say. But I convinced him to do it on behalf of all of his children. And so I gave pretty much these remarks are very similar in front of him in the audience. And so he told me afterwards that he thought maybe I had exaggerated some qualities a little bit, but I could tell he was pleased. So I feel like I'm on safe ground. I have his approval on what otherwise would be a pure eulogy. So what I want to say, since I'm not covering the ground Brian did, although there may be a little bit of overlap, is just say something about him as a father. Because although he was a judge and a lawyer for most of his career, he was first of all a person and a parent. And I think how a father impacts his children says something important about him as a person. And today we are, I think, celebrating my father as a person as well as a judge. And of course, those are intimately related. I've always believed that parents teach their children much more by what they do than what they say. By that standard, my father's first lesson was honesty. To see and to have the courage to acknowledge things as they are. And to seek to understand, to seek to get to the heart of the matter. I feel like I learned this from him. But beyond honesty, the other interesting thing about my father was that he had an irrepressible optimism. You know, he truly believed and was deeply convinced that human beings as individuals and as a society as a whole can improve and evolve in their awareness and their actions. That we're linked to something bigger than our individual selves that pushes us to realize our potential in life. And this is still my impression of my father's spirit. You know, it was a marvelous gift to his family and his close friends, but even people that just knew him a little bit or maybe heard him speak once. It was very, very uplifting to be around him. Dad also taught us early to respect all kinds of people at a time when that respect was not always popular. You know, we lived in East Texas in the 1950s, and I would have to say that the majority of my friends and their families accepted racial prejudice as natural and right. But my father was making speeches and giving sermons against racism long before civil rights was a popular cause, particularly in that area, and at some personal risk, things that I learned more later. But more important than what he said was how I saw him treat individual people. You know, the man that took care of our yard, my babysitter, the family that we took groceries and a little money to at Christmas. But he was never patronizing. You know, it was he just liked everybody. He liked these people the same as he pretty much liked everybody. And I think that's probably what everybody here who knew him, how they will remember him. You knew it by the shine in his eyes when he looked at you. It was never something mechanical. He connected when he talked to you. And he treated everybody as equal in dignity and worth, and helped us realize that no one is really more important than anyone else. My father was a friend of books and learning. He had a standing offer with all his children that he would pay for any book we wanted to read. He encouraged us to study whatever interested us at whatever school we wanted to go to. He supported our travels and our experiments in seeing as much of the world as possible. But I do think, however, the greatest gift that Dad gave us by his example was the courage to make our own decisions. That is, to refuse to the easy alternative of letting other people make decisions for us. As an example, he was tempted at several stages of his career early with the offers of powerful and respected men, offers of employment that carried, however, a condition of absolute allegiance and exclusivity. To choose to say no was an act of courage and independence. I think these are qualities that everybody that knew my father saw. They were unmistakable in him. But like all of us, Dad liked a certain amount of continuity and routine in his life. So it was somewhat surprising to me at the age of 83, he had the courage to risk marrying a second time and robbing the cradle at that. I had my doubts, not about Carolyn, but about whether my father had the flexibility to live with anyone else after 60 years of marriage to my mother. So I suggested to him that maybe he and Carolyn ought to just try living together for a little while to see if they were really compatible.
That was never going to work.
He didn't think much of my idea. And he was certainly right. I'm completely convinced that my dad's long life is attributable in large part to Carolyn. For one thing, as I think many of you know, nobody knows more about or has better access to the best doctors in Houston. But even more important was the way that she and Dad stimulated and emotionally supported each other. My siblings and I will always owe her a great debt of gratitude for being such an important part of his life. And gratitude is the final theme that I take from my father's life. Especially in the last year and a half, he suffered through a physical decline, and at times, like any human being, he was angry, sad, fearful. But he was never bitter. He never tried to withdraw from life. The overarching mood that he expressed was gratitude. He was grateful for his long life, for Carolyn, for his judicial colleagues, for the marshals and the court personnel who greeted him every morning, carried his briefcase, and held the elevator for him. He was grateful for his doctors, for the nurses and caregivers who were with him every day, for his housekeeper, for his children, for his grandchildren, for his great-grandchildren and their families, and all his friends. And he expressed that gratitude to everyone. He made us feel loved and appreciated. He made us feel that he was proud of all of us. The mood of gratitude automatically can move us away from our egos and concerns about the self. And I can think of no better way for him or anyone to face the inevitable end of our time on earth. So I've tried to mention here just some of what my dad gave us, but words are really too little. The whole of him as a man was much more than this. So his ultimate gift to us was simply himself and his presence in our lives. In the Spanish language, there are two forms for the word you. One is tú, which is the familiar form used between family and friends. In the family, tú carries the feeling of a relaxed emotional closeness in the relationship. The other word for you is usted, which is used more in formal address, principally to convey a sense of respect. So normally, in the family, children and spouses address each other as tú, in familiar form. But sometimes, as the family matures, they begin, for instance, a husband and wife might begin to talk to each other using the form usted, for you. And this way of using the formal you is not to imply a lack of emotional closeness, but it's just to express a situation where, from a long relationship, a sense of deep respect grows and develops that just has to find a voice. And so in that sense, for myself and on behalf of my family, friends, colleagues, with Dad looking over my shoulder, I'd like to say that this celebration is for usted, Dad. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. We really very much appreciate it. We love Tom. We certainly miss him. We thank each of you for joining us today to remember and to honor him. This will conclude today's tribute to Judge Tom Reavley before the en banc court. And thank you again for sharing this time with each of us and among ourselves. We really appreciate it. And this was the brainchild of Judge Jolly. Grady, thank you.
Grady, thank you.